So Maclean's magazine gave terrorist Omar Khadr the full celebrity treatment this week. Look at their cover. It's so gross. Khadr is a murderer, a Muslim fascist, a member of Al-Qaeda who has never renounced that terrorist group. He's a convicted war criminal. He told his guards at Guantanamo Bay that murdering a U.S. Army medic, Sergeant Christopher Spear, was the best day of his life. But Maclean's put him on the cover as a smiling celebrity, and they actually called him a victim and compared him to two real victims, Renelle Harper, an Aboriginal woman who was raped and left for dead in Winnipeg, and Amanda Lindhout, an amateur journalist who went to Somalia and was kidnapped and raped repeatedly by Muslim terrorists until her family paid a ransom for her. So on the cover, one predator and two victims, and Maclean's equated them all on their cover in their issue that's being mailed out now, their Remembrance Day issue. Isn't that sweet and patriotic of them? On Remembrance Day, Maclean's will celebrate the terrorist who murdered a soldier and planted IEDs that may have killed more. If you want to see more about this, click my video on the subject here. But I have an update. A viewer sent me this very subtly modified image that you might not even notice at first. Look, he photoshopped a large sword into Khadr's hands. You don't notice it right away, do you? But then you can't miss it, and it's shocking because they're all smiling, the two rape victims and the murderer on the cover of the magazine together. The sword is shocking because it reminds you how inappropriate putting two rape victims smiling in the same cover as a Al-Qaeda terrorist smiling is. It's just so weird. This sword reminds you of how inappropriate it is. That's great guerrilla counter-journalism, I thought. I mean, Maclean's is just gross. I suppose People magazine in the US puts Kim Kardashian on the cover when they need to sell some copies. She's gross, but she didn't murder anyone. What's next? I don't know. Maclean's doing a dating advice column with Paul Bernardo or something. My point is that sword is so dissonant. It's a reminder that what Maclean's doing is grotesque. Anyway, so just as a lark, I tweeted this photoshopped image on Twitter with no comment. I just said Maclean's. Now, most people didn't even really notice the subtle change, but then a bunch of journalists saw the Photoshop and lashed out as a pack. Not at Maclean's for putting a terrorist on their cover, but at me for reminding anyone that he was a terrorist. Here, take a look at some of the tweets that came as a wolf pack at me. Here's Jimmy Thompson, who writes for Vice and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. Here he is suggesting the Photoshop was racist, lame, or desperate. Not Maclean's putting a terrorist on their cover as a celebrity and a victim, but me reminding people that he was a terrorist. That's racist, according to one journalist. Here's another journalist, Chris Vandenbreekel, a radio reporter in Fort McMurray. "You disgust me," he wrote. "This is propaganda on your part, not theirs." Pardon? It's not propaganda to call a murderer a victim, but it's propaganda to remind people he's a murderer. Say, do you think Vandenbreekel's listeners in Fort McMurray would agree with him? I wrote back to him and invited him to open his radio talk show phone lines about the subject, get a bit of a reality check from real people on what they think of terrorists. Here's a tweet from my old friend, that loser with Vice magazine, Mac Lamra. He said, "One day you're gonna get someone seriously hurt with your vile rhetoric, Levant." Look at how much dumb is crammed into those 14 words. Lamara is worried about getting someone seriously hurt, apparently. Yeah, me too, like Sergeant Christopher Spear, murdered by Omar Khadr. Maclean's venerating a terrorist as a folk hero isn't vile to Mac, but me criticizing them is, and of course the implication that my mere words need to be reined in. There's that flicker of authoritarian censorship on the left again. Here's another journalist, Taylor Lambert, who is surprisingly inarticulate for a journalist. He's not a sharp thinker. All he can do is swear. He's not sure why he's upset, but here's the weirdest examples. My former colleagues at the Sun newspaper chain, I mean, the Sun is the tough-on-crime newspaper chain, the anti-terrorist chain, and it believes in irreverent journalism too, poking fun at things, photoshops on their cover. But for some reason, a bunch of Sun journalists were outraged by me and my tweet. Here's Trevor Robb from the Edmonton Sun. He tells me I'm not classy. But Maclean's is classy to celebrate a terrorist? I'm not classy for mocking them. And everyone knows that the Sun is all about classy. Here's Dave Dormer of the Calgary Sun, probably the most right-wing readers in Canada, but he says it was beyond the pale. Not Maclean's, but me for mocking Maclean's. Here's Tyler Dawson of the Ottawa Citizen, also owned by Post Media, who was so shocked he didn't know what to say, but he tweeted about it several times. That's the lame millennial rebuttal to anything. I can't even. I saw that a lot. I should remind you that the Ottawa Citizen was the newspaper that literally gave Omar Khadr a guest column in their newspaper without a disclaimer that he was a convicted terrorist, murderer, to talk about national security and terrorism, literally on the day of Corporal Nathan Cirillo's funeral. On the day Canada was burying a young soldier murdered by a Muslim terrorist, the newspaper of record in our capital city gave a Muslim terrorist a column in their editorial pages. What would a millennial say? Yeah, I can't even. There were so many more tweets, I won't go through them all. The intellectual class, or the self-described intellectual class, everyone who calls themselves a writer, weirdly. I don't get it, writers. Here's one. Here's another one. Here's another one. I mean, what's with these writers? Here's a writer who thinks I should be sued for being so mean. You know, when I say the phrase media party, I'm often talking about partisan politics like their love affair for Justin Trudeau, but most of the time, in between elections, the media party is even more pernicious. The media party is not just a partisan monoculture, it's an ideas monoculture, and it is depraved. And anyone who would be more upset about a Photoshop of a sword in Omar Khadr's hands than they are upset with Omar Khadr being normalized in Maclean's magazine's Remembrance Day edition, that's a sign of deep sickness in our media, don't you think? For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.